Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex, coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... In this episode, since I'm continuing forward with my TBR pile from last year, I'm reviewing Those Across the River by Christopher Buhelman. But before I get started, I would like to thank the viewer Sloan Chessman for recommending this book, and I would like to thank my good online friend Gina for buddy reading it with me. Also, before I went into this read, I honestly didn't do that much research, so I was really surprised to see how deep and heavy this book was. And for that reason, I was really happy that Gina buddy read this with me, because it provided us with an outlet where we could toss ideas back and forth to one another. But anywho, Gina and Sloan, if you're watching this, I hope you enjoy the review because this was a book that I couldn't put down, and at times it did actually creep me out and scare me. So without further ado, let's head on off to Withboro, Georgia, and see why it's important to keep tradition even though times might be hard. Those Across the River by Christopher Buhelman takes place during the Great Depression, where it introduces a history professor by the name of Frank and his girlfriend Dora. Early on, they relocate into a house in Georgia that had been bequeathed to him by his deceased Aunt Dottie. However, in the will, his Aunt Dottie had specified that he not keep the house, but to sell it. Then, as Frank and Dora become a part of their new community known as Withboro, one day they encounter a folk tradition that's held once a month when the moon grows full. Which, in this tradition, the local church hosts a ceremony where they send pigs across the river on a ferry. Once the pigs are delivered to this infamous patch of land, they are never seen or heard from again. Then, as the Great Depression bears down on Withboro, the townspeople vote to stop sending the pigs because they need the food. From here, a series of grisly events plague the town as those who had been secretly residing across the river demand that they send more pigs or else. Published in 2011, Charlaine Harris said Those Across the River was one of the best first novels she had ever read, and in that same year it was nominated for the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. In an interview conducted by The Quillery, Buhelman explained his influences were Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and he speculated these authors could have inspired him to set his story in the 1930s. Other inspirations included Cormac McCarthy and Stephen King. Buhelman added that before writing this classic, he knew the nature of the antagonist first. Then horrific images came to him, and last, a narrative formed around those images. Upon researching the time period, Buhelman referenced books, and he read first-hand accounts of the Argonne Offensive in the First World War. Also, he read social histories of the Great Depression, histories about slavery and old plantations, books about PTSD, and anything at all written during the period of the Great Depression. He relied on archival photos, news articles, and a lot of Turner Classic Movies. Buhelman explained he shelved the first draft of Those Across the River for many years, and he reapproached it after having more life and writing experience, and a stronger knowledge of history. Fun facts! Here's a few things you might not know about Christopher Buhelman. Throughout his life, Christopher Buhelman has been an attendee of Renaissance festivals. Over his 25 years of attending, Buhelman developed an act called Christopher the Insulter. While acting this role, his duty is to roast fairgoers for money at the request of their friends. He has also written a festival stage show called The Bastard Monks, and has performed the show Filthy Irish Stories for the Stirling Renaissance Festival. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoilers section, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you like, scroll down to the comments and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. All you have to do is click that timestamp and it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the school scene, which prior to this, the town had already discontinued the pig's ritual, and because of that, they're feeling the repercussions where a local boy by the name of Tyson has been murdered. Shortly after his death, someone breaks into the hardware store and steals all of its rope and shovels. But as time passes, people really don't think that much about the theft. That is until one day when Frank is called to the schoolhouse, where he finds Dora sitting under a tree completely traumatized. Then he notices men coming out of the school with their shirts tied to the lower half of their face, acting as a filter, and they're all completely horrified and gagging. Then, after he works up the nerve to see what's going on, Frank looks inside and sees where Tyson's dead body, as well as 12 other corpses, have been unearthed from their cemetery and tied to the school tables. And written on the blackboard in mud is the warning, "Send the pigs." When I read this, I was able to look past its shock value and appreciate it on a deeper level. Which, personally, I've always been disturbed by the idea of corpse and grave desecration because it feels like it's the ultimate cruelty that an individual can do to the loved ones of the deceased. So, for starters, this moment proved to me the antagonist had no limits when it came down to devastating the townspeople. And because of when this moment took place, we still had a lot of book left to read, and I ended up developing a great level of tension that did not let up until I finished reading. Which the main reason why is because I knew things were going to get worse. Also, aside from that, I was really interested in this moment because it was very symbolic. Like, for example, with the corpses that had been dug up, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 that took place in current time, all the other corpses died before this book even started. And this made me think, well, the antagonists are not only creating this horrific scene, but they are showing how the past has never received closure, so they're digging the past up, and the past has done nothing but fester and rot. My next favorite moment was the home invasion scene at Frank and Dora's, which, leading up to this, they had heard screams come from the Noble house. And since Frank's the kind of person who tries to save the day, he grabs his gun and runs next door to find Mr. Noble has been knocked unconscious, and the oldest Noble daughter has had her hand ripped off. Then, after he finds that the youngest Noble daughter is okay, he soon realizes that something has drugged Mrs. Noble from the house. From here, he follows her blood trail and discovers that a werewolf is eating her, which, as soon as he has this confrontation, he hauls ass. But because Mr. Noble has locked his door, Frank runs home and locks himself inside where a werewolf eventually breaks in. However, as soon as the werewolf enters his line of view, Frank shoots the werewolf with a miniature cannon that he has loaded with silverware. Unfortunately, I don't have anything profound to say about this moment, except I honestly loved how Frank used a weapon of the past to harm a product of the past. Like, that was just really cool and something that I was not expecting. But aside from that, this moment was really badass, and it was so fast-paced that I was blindsided to the point where I couldn't predict what was going to happen next, which, of course, was a major surprise when Frank pulled out the cannon. And since I had never seen a werewolf harmed by a cannon stuffed with silverware before, this moment will stick with me for a long time. My final favorite moment was the cave scene. Now, prior to this, Frank was able to escape with Bro, and after he got to safety, he contacted two of his friends from the military by the names of Granny and Hiker. And even though Granny doesn't believe his story, he makes Frank these jars of mustard gas because he feels like he owes him. After that, the three men go to Withbro and ambush the cave where the werewolves have taken refuge. Then, once the men are in position, Hiker takes the jars of mustard gas and throws them in the cave, and when the inhabitants come running out, Hiker and Frank shoot them down. Which eventually this becomes a little too much for Granny, so he runs back to his car, and in the process, Hiker gets killed by the head werewolf, but even still, Frank is able to keep going where he continues killing off the pack. Although I really love this moment because it was so damned intense, it was also very interesting to see characters like Mike who were able to regrow their missing limbs after they became a werewolf. Otherwise, the scene was very unexpectedly emotional, and it made me feel sorry for a young boy who had been turned into a werewolf, because after he had ran out of the cave covered in mustard gas, he pled to everyone not to shoot him because he hadn't killed anybody. Then he begged for them just to let him go to the river so he could clean the chemicals off. Which, although Frank does allow him to do this, it would have been more humane had Frank shot the poor kid rather than letting him suffer. And because of how this plays out, it really made me consider the wars where children are caught in the crossfire of battle, and it just really brought a lot of attention to the reality of that subject. Although this book gave me its fair share of characters to bitch about, I'm going to use this opportunity to shine the light on Frank. First off, I'll give him credit where credit is due, because when duty calls, Frank runs to save the day. So in that regards, he is a hero. However, at the same time, he is a damn creeper who needs to learn how to compose his hormones. I mean, my God, the man can't stop thinking about the JJ for 5 damn seconds. And yeah, we have that whole bit where he stole his colleague's wife and all that jazz, but you know what? It takes two to tango. And if Frank and Dora really loved one another and she wasn't happy in her marriage, then so be it. Go be happy. However, this is the problem I have with Frank. Even though he's engaged to Dora, he flirts with other people in front of her. And to make it worse, he flirted with a 14-year-old girl. And just to give you some perspective here, the bastard's like 40 years old. I mean, my God, he could be her friggin' dad. Now, some of y'all might be like, but Alex, this was a different time. People matured faster back then. Bullshit. I don't care how fast you matured. At the end of the day, this is a grown-ass man hitting on a child. I mean, she ain't even had her first damn prom yet, and here he is making eyes at her. I mean, that's just nasty, y'all. No. And then the thing is, when Dora calls him out on his bullshit, he's like, it was just harmless flirting. And another thing about this perverted jackass, he might think he's all progressive and shit because he argued that owning slaves was wrong. Well, that might be so, but it doesn't stop him from admiring his great-grandfather who was a sadistic slave owner. Like, for real, this old fart was so sick and twisted, he would have made Desaad himself try to find comfort in Christ. That's how messed up he was. Aside from that, Frank does have a lot of internal racism that he never fully deals with, because every time he's confronted by a black person, he thinks a racial slur, and even though he knows it's wrong, he never does the self-improvement to try to get over this asshole mentality. Those Across the River by Christopher Buhelman was everything I could hope for in a werewolf novel, especially since it focused on folk horror and it paid its respects to the Southern Gothic subgenre. Also, aside from how rich this story was, it presented complex characters and it unapologetically presented the subjects of racism, PTSD, the after effects of the Civil War, economic hardships, and much more. Character wise, everyone felt realistic. And because of the cast that we were given, it made me feel really grateful that I was not born in the 1930s. Which, among all of the adults, the only person who felt like she didn't have a mean-spirited bone in her body was Dora. But aside from her, I really did like the secondary character named Martin because he saw the people of Withborough for what they really were, and he wasn't afraid to call them out on their bullshit. Also, even though there were quite a few crappy people in town, he did still give them a fair warning. Now, aside from the adults, I really felt like the children were primarily innocent, and I didn't see the actions or philosophies of their parents reflected in them, which this made me feel hopeful for the future generation. And I wish I could elaborate on this a little bit more, but if I did, I would reveal some spoilers. But all I can say is, because of what happens to a few of the children, it feels like they're paying for the actions of their ancestors. Theme-wise, this book focuses on how racism is a deeply seated issue that's generational. And unfortunately, it will continue until that cycle is broken. Also, it does comment on internal racism as well. Like, for example, Frank is vocal about how it was wrong to own slaves, and he admits that while he's fascinated with his great-grandfather Savoyard as a cavalry officer, he's also disgusted by how his great-grandfather treated slaves. So, at the very least, there's that. But at the same time, whenever Frank is confronted by a person of color, his knee-jerk reaction is to think a racial slur. So even though he might consider himself to be progressive for this time, he still has a lot of internal self-improvement to do. Continuing with that subject is the topic of whitewashing, which this is seen by how a character tries to dismiss the horrors of slavery by saying that the house slaves of Savoyard had it good because they were well dressed and they were under his roof. And reading in between the lines of how she glorified this subject, I saw she was the type of individual who felt like slavery wasn't as bad as what everyone made it out to be, and that slaves should have been grateful for the opportunity to serve. Which I honestly wish that I could say this was a fictional mentality, but since I've grown up in the South, unfortunately, this is a type of ignorance that I have encountered multiple times throughout my life. Next, this book shows how the Civil War continued to affect generations after it was over. And since the setting takes place in the South, we see how outdated philosophies that should have ended with the Civil War continued to thrive in those who survived. In turn, these outdated philosophies were passed down to their children and their children's children until here we are today. Also, since this book took place during the Great Depression, it really brought into perspective for me that the Civil War honestly wasn't that long ago. Like, even by today's standards in 2022, it's only been 157 years since the Civil War. Then, to bring us more up to speed, it's only been 54 years since the Civil Rights Movement ended. So, yeah, this is all still very fresh. And it brings me back to what I earlier said. Racism is a deeply seated issue that is generational, and unfortunately, it is not going to end until the cycle is broken. Another subject this book focuses on is PTSD, which this is seen by what Frank goes through as he had served in World War I, where he was injured and saw his friends die around him. Now, for the most part, PTSD comes to him in the form of a nightmare, But what I found to be really interesting was even though World War I was a thing of his past, another warlike scenario presents itself to him while he's in Whitborough. And every time he goes across the river, it feels like he's entered a battlefield. Also, there's even one point where he becomes a POW across the river. Then we have a scene where he relies on his military skills to get him through what's going on. So, in a way, this kind of made me feel like for veterans, the war is never over. Another focal point is economic hardships. And since everyone knows that poverty can back a person into a corner, this book shows how it can force a person to act out of character or change their daily routines. Which, a good example of this is seen by how the town of Withborough discontinues their monthly ceremony, and because of that, we have a string of violent events that follow. Adding on to that, I really feel like this book showed the psychological effects of poverty and how that can intensify a person's anxiety, depression, and anger. Which I really have no proof to back what I'm about to say, but there's a part of me that really feels like this was a contributing factor to the tension that weighed heavy over Withborough. Now, aside from all of that, as I said earlier, this book does cover quite a few other subjects, but unfortunately, I don't have time to cover all of those. Just know that this book is a bird of many feathers, and I could talk about it for the next few hours. But since time is short, moving on. At first, those across the river didn't scare me. However, recently when I go outside at night, I find myself looking over my shoulder because of some of the scenes that Buehlman wrote. So for that reason, this is actually the first werewolf book that scared me. Other than that, there were quite a few scenes that did creep me out, and once or twice I was grossed out. Those Across the River by Christopher Buhelman is perhaps the best werewolf novel I have ever read. And after Gina and I finished our buddy read, we gushed about how even though this felt like a rich piece of literature, the author totally knew what fans of the old school werewolf wanted. And even though there are some scenes that are disturbing and grotesque, these aren't done for just the sake of shock value. Instead, these are done to break the character down so the reader can have more emotions towards that character. So, at the end of the day, if you are looking for an old school werewolf novel that focuses on some pretty hard hitting subjects while it presents complex characters, then I do highly recommend Those Across the River. Well, now that we have that covered, it's time to close out the video. But before I do, I would like to thank these awesome people for contributing to my Patreon account. Here's a list of my Patreon contributors, and as you can tell, some of them are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute as well, I have a link available to my Patreon in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos like what you see here. And if there is a specific title or profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll do it. Also, I do have a second tier available that is $10 a month. And aside from receiving the shout out that you see, you would also receive one creepy photo at the beginning of every month, which I do creepy photography on the side. So once you receive that image, you can print it off or do whatever you like with it. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.